One autumn morning in Dallas, Pastor Robert Jeffress, the famous preacher, unexpectedly stood in the middle of the street, handing out bread to the homeless. His act of kindness attracted harsh criticism from Karen, a wealthy and arrogant woman, but she had no idea that, from a distance, none other than Donald Trump, Pastor Jeffress's longtime friend, was silently witnessing the entire event. What will happen when these harsh words face the truth of compassion and faith? Will Karen realize the profound lesson about life that both Trump and Pastor Jeffress are trying to share? One autumn morning, the gentle sunlight filtered through the golden leaves, casting a fresh and warm atmosphere over the streets of Dallas. While the crowd hurried along, the cars zoomed by endlessly, and the bustling noise of the big city echoed everywhere. There was a different scene at a small corner near downtown. There, amid the hustle and bustle of the modern city, stood an elderly man with silver hair and frail hands. Yet his eyes radiated a strange sense of peace. He was Pastor Robert Jeffress, the founder and leader of First Baptist Church in Dallas. Today, instead of standing on the pulpit preaching the Word of God, he was at a small stand with a sign that read, "Free bread for those in need." There were no bright lights from luxury stores or the noise of fashionable shops around, but the homeless people lining up in front of him could feel a special kind of light. It wasn't the light of stores or expensive cars, but the light of compassion, of a genuine love that Pastor Jeffress had for each one of them. This scene surprised many passers-by. A famous pastor, with power and fame, was standing in the street in simple clothes, handing out bread and bottles of water to the homeless. No one could understand this sacrifice, but to him, this was what God taught, to love and serve, without distinction of class or circumstance. While the world outside was full of divisions, he chose to be close, to engage, and to share with those people whom society often forgets. The homeless around him felt the difference. They were people all too familiar with indifference and contempt from others. But at this moment, as they received warm loaves of bread from his hands, they felt they were no longer forgotten. Some had red eyes. Others had trembling hands as they accepted the bread. They felt that, even as homeless people, cast aside by society, they still had worth and deserved to be loved. Pastor Jeffress smiled and gently shared, "God always teaches us to love and serve, not because they deserve it, but because we are called to do so." He didn't need to say anything more. His eyes and small actions alone conveyed a powerful message of compassion, humility, and love that God wanted everyone to practice. From this street corner, though no one noticed, those in poverty were receiving something more precious than bread and water. They were receiving love, respect, and the hope that no matter their circumstances, they were not abandoned. While others focused solely on what could be bought, Pastor Jeffress did what very few could. He gave not just material things, but his heart, his care, and a reminder of the true values of life. Karen, a woman in her mid-40s, strutted down the busy streets of Dallas, her designer dress glinting under the afternoon sun. Every step she took seemed as if the whole city should part for her. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, echoing her sense of superiority. As people hurried past her, she stood out, not because of any extraordinary grace or beauty, but because she demanded attention. There was an aura of importance around her, as if everyone else's existence was secondary to hers. She didn't just walk down the street, she commanded it, relishing every glance cast her way. As she turned a corner, her sharp eyes caught sight of something she hadn't anticipated. A group of homeless people gathered around a food stand. Pastor Jeffress, a well-known and respected figure in the city, was calmly distributing loaves of bread and warm meals. Karen halted, her heels grinding to a stop as she took in the scene. The sight of a powerful, Successful man like Pastor Jeffress dedicating his time to this humble task struck her as utterly absurd. To her, this was a gross display of self-righteousness. Here was a man with a megaphone-worthy reputation, reduced to serving bread to the downtrodden. Karen's lip curled with disdain as she crossed her arms, her high heels clicking even louder as she marched toward the crowd, seeking to get closer, almost as if drawn by the absurdity of it all. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "Oh my God, this is ridiculous. He's a famous pastor, a man who could be running a multi-million-dollar ministry. And yet here he is, handing out bread to these people?" Her eyes scanned the faces of the homeless, and her tone was thick with mockery. What a joke. What's he really doing for them? Maybe just trying to make himself feel like a saint. There's no real change here. Karen's laughter rang out loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. It was harsh, almost cruel, and the people around her felt an unease in the air, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. Some of the homeless bowed their heads, avoiding eye contact, while others simply kept their distance. But Karen was oblivious to the discomfort she caused. "Oh, please, give me a break," Karen continued, her voice laced with venom. "What's he really doing here? These people are stuck in their ways. They'll never change. And you know what? Neither will he. A nice face, a famous name. And yet, what does he have to offer?" Her laughter echoed through the space, making some people near her shift uncomfortably. But Pastor Jeffress remained calm, almost serene. His eyes locked with hers for a moment, but he said nothing. He simply smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that seemed to say he had heard worse. He had been here before. Karen wasn't done. Her voice grew sharper, as if she was trying to cut through the air with her words. "Oh, I get it now," she sneered. "He thinks he's doing something great, doesn't he? Helping these people as if that's going to make him a hero. What a laugh. They're just taking advantage of his kindness, and he's too blind to see it. You can't change anything with bread. Pastor, I could buy an entire building without having to stand here doing this." The people around her started to whisper among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with her cruel words. A few of the homeless people glanced at each other, unsure whether to speak out against the woman who had no idea what true compassion looked like. But no one dared to challenge her, except one man. From the crowd, a homeless man, gaunt and thin, wearing nothing more than a tattered coat, slowly stood up. His voice was rough but full of conviction. "You may think that, but we don't need you to judge us. Pastor Jeffress helps us because he believes in something good. We don't live our lives to please you, or anyone like you. We're just trying to survive." Karen spun around, her eyes flashing with anger. "Oh, now it's the homeless speaking up," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Doesn't he help you just so he can feel good about himself? I could buy a whole building to house all of you and still not have to lower myself like this. What's the point?" Her words stung the man, but he didn't back down. He held her gaze, silent but unshaken. The air was thick with tension as the onlookers looked from Karen to Pastor Jeffress. Some of the homeless felt embarrassed by Karen's words, but they remained quiet. Pastor Jeffress, calm and composed as ever, took a step forward. "You have every right to think what you think," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "But don't forget, compassion isn't about showing off how good we are. It's about helping those who need it, even if no one notices. I don't do this for your approval or for anyone else's. I do it because this is what God has called us to do." Karen's face twisted with frustration, her hands clenching into fists. "What God teaches, I don't need to listen to," she shouted, her voice now filled with anger and defiance. "This is all a scam. You're just trying to create a good image for yourself. You think you're changing something? You're not. You're just playing pretend." The air around them seemed to freeze. Silence spread like wildfire. A collective breath held by everyone in the vicinity. Karen's face flushed red with frustration as she stood there, her eyes flashing, trying to hold her ground. But in that moment, Pastor Jeffress didn't argue, didn't try to change her mind. He simply stood there, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. His eyes met Karen's, but he said nothing. There, in the middle of the crowded street, with the echoes of Karen's words hanging heavy in the air, Pastor Jeffress allowed the silence to speak louder than anything else could. He knew that no amount of arguing could make Karen see the truth of his actions. She had to see it for herself, and for the first time, Karen began to feel an uncomfortable shift within her. Something, perhaps the weight of her own words, began to settle in her chest. But for now, she remained silent. There was no immediate apology, no sudden change of heart, but the tension that hung between them was palpable. The crowd waited, unsure of what would come next. Despite facing constant mockery from Karen and others, Pastor Robert Jeffress stood firm, unwavering in his mission and purpose. He continued handing out bread and water to the homeless, every gesture radiating peace and compassion, with no arrogance or discrimination. Even amidst the laughter and disdain from a few passers-by, Pastor Jeffress remained there, calm as if all the external challenges could not disturb his spirit. However, among those unfamiliar eyes, there was one person watching him closely, someone Karen could never have imagined: Donald Trump. He stood quietly across the street, dressed in a black suit, his face filled with focus, though busy with his schedule. This time he was not here for a political event, but by chance, he had stopped right in this neighborhood, just a few steps away from Pastor Jeffress. Trump was no stranger to Pastor Jeffress. They had shared a close relationship for many years. Together, they had hosted several religious events, always standing by each other in significant moments, especially during Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. Pastor Jeffress was one of the first to publicly support him, helping him build a bridge to the religious community and faith-based Americans. As Trump watched Pastor Jeffress continue handing out bread to the poor, memories of their encounters, conversations, and Pastor Jeffress's guidance flooded his mind. In moments of difficulty during the campaign, when criticism and tension ran high, it was Pastor Jeffress who stood by Trump, encouraging him not only on political strategy but also about deeper values in life. Each time Trump felt cornered or exhausted, he would remember Pastor Jeffress's advice: "Trump, don't forget that success is not just measured by money or power. True success is knowing how to love, how to share, and placing your faith in higher things." These words not only helped Trump in politics, but also served as a guiding principle in his life. Thanks to deep conversations with Pastor Jeffress, Trump began to realize that a path to long-lasting success isn't just based on victory or talent, but also on patience, compassion, and steadfast faith. In this moment, as he watched Pastor Jeffress hand out food to the poor, Trump felt a deep sensation he had never thought about before. It wasn't about winning or money, but about contribution and true compassion. He saw in Pastor Jeffress's actions not only a role model of faith, but also a lesson in humility and sacrifice. Though he was a man of power and wealth, Trump realized that greatness isn't always something immediately visible. Sometimes, service and compassion come through small acts, like the warm loaves of bread Pastor Jeffress was handing to the homeless. Trump stood still for a moment, reflecting more deeply on this relationship, on the mentor who had guided him through the important moments of his life. He silently thought to himself, "This is why I have always supported him, not just because I respect his faith, but because he's the one who helped me realize the true value of success." The quiet was broken only by the sound of Trump's footsteps. His presence was unmistakable. even in the midst of the bustling streets. The energy of the political event had already been building up around him, but something pulled him away from the crowd, something that couldn't be ignored. His gaze drifted across the scene before him, drawn to Pastor Jeffress, who was calmly and compassionately handing out loaves of bread to the homeless. Trump wasn't someone to usually step out of the spotlight or break the flow of his scheduled appearances. But today, in that very moment, he felt a powerful tug deep inside of him, a voice that told him to speak, to act, and to be part of something bigger than the event he was attending. Each step Trump took toward Pastor Jeffress seemed to echo through the air, his heels thudding against the pavement in a rhythmic beat that signaled an impending shift. The world around him seemed to slow down, the noises of the event fading away, and all eyes turned toward him as he made his way through the crowd. As Trump walked closer, a hush fell over the street. The noise of the crowd and the murmur of voices disappeared into a heavy silence. People watched with curiosity as the former president approached the small stand where Pastor Jeffress was engaged in his work. Trump stopped, just a step away from Karen, who stood with her arms crossed, an air of superiority emanating from her. She had been looking down at Pastor Jeffress and the homeless, her disdain for what she saw evident in every sneer and scoff. But Trump wasn't there to engage with Karen's bitterness. His mission was different. He had something to say. Without hesitation, Trump's deep, commanding voice broke the silence, clear and direct, carrying across the still street. "You're wrong," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the air. He turned to face Karen fully, his eyes unwavering. "This man is not just a pastor. He's a friend, a mentor, and the one who taught me some of the most important lessons in my life." Karen turned sharply, her eyes wide with disbelief, her jaw dropping ever so slightly as she looked up at the man who was now standing before her, Trump, the man she never imagined would be the one to defend someone like Pastor Jeffress. But Trump didn't pause. He continued, speaking with authority, but also with a gentleness that caught Karen off guard. "Years ago, I thought that money was everything, but when I met Mr. Jeffress, I realized that true wealth isn't in a bank account. It's in the ability to help others, to share with them, and to make a real difference in their lives." Trump's words hit Karen like a wave crashing against a wall. She stood frozen, the weight of his statement pulling the breath from her chest. The crowd around them grew quiet. Sensing the shift in the conversation, Karen had no retort, no defense to offer. She simply stared, stunned and speechless, at the man who had just shattered the foundation of her belief system with nothing more than a few sentences. The air seemed thicker now, the tension palpable, but there was more to come. As Trump's words lingered in the space, a middle-aged man from the crowd, a face weathered by time and hardship, stepped forward. His gray hair was a sign of his years, and his eyes showed a depth of experience few could understand. He was a man who had been helped by both Pastor Jeffress and Trump, a man who had turned his life around with their guidance. "Mr. Trump," the man said, his voice shaky but full of gratitude, "I can't forget what you did for me. You helped me get my job back when I had nothing. You gave me a chance when I thought there was no way out. I've been able to support my family again, and it's all because of the help you and Pastor Jeffress gave me. We won't forget you. You've always been there for us." Trump's face softened, and a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He turned to the man, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of understanding and support. "Thank you," Trump said, his voice warm. "But don't forget that everything I've done for you, and everything I've done for others, is just me continuing what Pastor Jeffress taught me. Everything I have today, everything I've achieved, I'm grateful to God and to people like him. It's faith and compassion that truly lead us to success." The crowd was now alive with murmurs. People who had been watching in silence now began to speak among themselves, discussing the profound words they had just witnessed. Karen, who had stood with her arms crossed in judgment, now found herself speechless. The arrogant gleam that had once dominated her eyes was replaced with surprise. She had no response to offer. Trump had spoken not just from a place of power, but from a place of sincerity. And Karen had no words that could match that. The energy around them had shifted. And for the first time, Karen felt the weight of her own assumptions, her own arrogance. She had assumed the worst about the pastor and his actions. But here was Trump, someone she had never imagined could be a proponent of compassion, speaking of it with such clarity. And just before turning away, Trump's voice cut through the stillness once more, quieter now but still with power. "Faith isn't just about religion," he said softly, his eyes scanning the crowd as he looked to Karen one last time. "It's about understanding that we can change our own lives and the lives of others by helping, by sharing, and by loving. Faith is the key to success." The crowd remained still for a long moment, the weight of Trump's words hanging in the air. Karen, now deeply affected by what she had heard, couldn't find the words to argue. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure of everything she had believed. The lessons of compassion and faith had planted a seed in her heart, and it was one that, perhaps, would take root in ways she couldn't yet understand. In the midst of the tense moment, with Karen still frozen by Trump's powerful words, a voice echoed from behind. A homeless man, his beard unkempt and eyes red from tears that had long run dry, stepped forward. His walk was slightly unsteady, but in his gaze, there was an undeniable resilience. He looked directly at Karen, then gently turned to Pastor Jeffress with a look of deep gratitude. "It's because of his help that I'm standing here today. I used to be a man who had completely lost his faith, wandering through life lost in drunkenness and loneliness. But Mr. Jeffress, he showed me that there was another way. He didn't just provide for me physically, but also spiritually. It was Pastor who helped me rediscover my faith in God and in myself." A silence fell over the space, and every eye in the area was on the homeless man. He continued, his voice somewhat choked with emotion. "Before I met Pastor Jeffress, I was a man with nothing but mistakes and failures. I lived on the fringes of society, abandoned and rejected. But thanks to the church and the people in the community, I've been able to find a job and a small home. I'm not homeless anymore." Karen stood frozen, a feeling she couldn't describe rising in her chest. His words, the raw and heartfelt stories, struck her like a knife to the heart. For the first time in her life, Karen felt a lump in her throat. Everything she had once thought and said about the homeless was now like a dark shadow sweeping through her mind. The reasons she had always looked down on people like them were beginning to fade away. She looked into the man's face, and in his eyes, she saw herself. She, too, had once been lost in arrogance, in misguided values. She realized that her perspective on others could harm those most in need of compassion. The stories of this man, his heartfelt words, were a powerful awakening that Karen never expected. She never imagined that change could come from those she had once deemed insignificant. Suddenly, her heart stirred. The contempt she once held was now a wound she had to face. Trump, still standing beside her, gave a small smile, but said nothing more. In this quiet atmosphere, the only sounds were the soft footsteps of passers-by, and the real-life stories continued to echo, serving as a reminder of the importance of compassion and humility. Trump stood silently, his gaze penetrating Karen's soul like a beam of light cutting through darkness. There was no anger or criticism, only a deep calm, an invisible strength radiating from him. His words were not just advice, but a powerful awakening, a cold wind sweeping away all of Karen's arrogance. Taking another step closer, Trump looked directly at her, his voice deep and full of understanding. "You can have everything you want in this world, luxurious homes, fancy cars, but if you don't know how to share, if you don't know how to help others, you'll always feel a void that can't be filled." True wealth doesn't come from money or material things. It comes from living for others, loving and sharing with those around you. Trump's words struck Karen like a powerful blow to the heart, leaving her speechless. She lowered her head, her heart heavy, unable to face his gaze. A wave of emotion surged up, sweeping away all her thoughts, making her feel the emptiness in her soul. Everything she once valued, everything she thought was important, now seemed meaningless. The space around them suddenly became eerily quiet. Only the sound of dry leaves falling and the sighs of those nearby. Karen suddenly realized that Trump's words were not just advice, but an awakening. She had lived with arrogance, judging others harshly, but now she saw that all of that was meaningless. In that moment, Karen understood that love, faith, and compassion were the most important things. It was the small but sincere actions that truly had the power to change lives. And for the first time in her life, Karen felt a deep transformation within herself. She sighed, feeling as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. But as she lifted her head, the gaze of a man in the crowd shifted towards Trump, and then an unexpected question erupted from him. "You're Donald Trump, aren't you?" Karen looked again, stunned to realize that the man standing before her was the president she had always heard about in the media, the one she never imagined she would meet. Before she could collect her thoughts, she felt a surge of astonishment rising within her. Trump smiled gently, a smile that wasn't one of arrogance, but simply understanding, a kindness she had never seen before. She stood still, unable to speak. Before her was a man who was not only the president, but also someone who had taught her a profound lesson about compassion and humility. "Yes, I'm Donald Trump," he said softly, "but today, I'm not the president. I'm just a man who wants to share something important with you. Compassion and faith will bring you the peace you've been searching for." Karen stood there, unable to believe what had just happened. Everything she had once thought was true had suddenly been turned upside down. And in that moment, she knew the lesson he taught wasn't just empty words. It was a deep awakening she would never forget. When the story came to an end, no one spoke further. Everyone stood in silence, as if a wave of quiet had descended over the bustling neighborhood. Karen stood there, her gaze unfocused, her hands still clutching her expensive handbag. Yet it seemed she no longer felt its importance. She felt an emptiness, an invisible space spreading through her mind, leaving her unable to find answers to questions she had never considered before. Trump's words and the heartfelt story shared by the homeless man continued to echo in her heart. The disdain she once held for the poor now seemed like a mirror reflecting her own selfishness. She couldn't deny that. Despite having all the money and material things, she still felt there was something missing, something important. She realized that the things she had valued most, power, wealth, and fame, were nothing but fleeting illusions, empty pursuits she had chased for years. Those things couldn't bring her peace of mind, nor could they heal the invisible wounds she had carried for so long. She lifted her head and looked at Pastor Jeffress and those around her, and for the first time, a true transformation took place in her heart. Faith and compassion were the values she had never fully understood or appreciated. She now understood that true wealth wasn't about accumulating material things, but about the ability to love and help others, the very people she had once hastily judged and overlooked. Karen didn't just change her view of Pastor Jeffress. Now she saw him not as a stranger in a clerical robe, but as a mirror of love and humility. She no longer saw the homeless as weak, but recognized them as strong, resilient people, deserving of opportunity and love. In that moment, Karen understood that true wealth lies in how we live for others, in the small acts of love, and in the willingness to share what we have with those around us. She realized that life is not just about oneself, but about relationships, connections, and sharing love. True wealth isn't in material possessions, but in the compassion we share and the lives we touch. Just like Pastor Jeffress and President Trump showed, sometimes the greatest lessons in life come from the smallest acts of kindness. May we all remember that our true success is measured not by what we have, but by how we love and serve others. Let this story remind us to open our hearts and be the light in someone's life. And here's a blessing for your readers. May you always find the strength to love beyond judgment, to serve without expecting anything in return, and to seek true wealth in the joy of helping others. May your actions be guided by compassion and your life be filled with peace.